In the history of every country there are battles that, let's say, did not bring glory to its weapons, and even more showed the military art of its armed forces from the most unsightly side. There is also such a battle in the history of the USA, though not very large scale, but very revealing. And for many years people wondered how it happened. But the secret always sooner or later becomes apparent, so today everything is in its place. It's about the Battle of the U.S. Army with the Indians at the Little Bighorn River. In the middle of the 19th century, developing the territories of the Wild West, white adventurers, settlers, and gold miners poured there, to the west, and this flow, of course, was unstoppable. But there all these people met the Aborigines Indians, the clash with which led to a series of Indian wars, a number of exactly 13, from 1861 to 1891. And that's not counting an incalculable number of small skirmishes between the Indians and the army and the settlers themselves. True, it should be said that the territory, where about 200,000 Indians lived, was controlled by only 18,000 soldiers. Both from movies and books we have a good idea of how the Wild West was conquered, but even today there are enough lacunas in it. But perhaps the most impressive, and in some ways mysterious even now, remains the defeat of General Custer's unit in the clash at Little Bighorn. Surprisingly, the Indians owe it to whites that they mastered the Great Plains. Before their arrival, they had no horses and roamed only on the outskirts of the Great Plains. Having learned to ride and tamed feral mustangs, the Indians created an entire nomadic empire, and what civilized state in the mid-19th century would have agreed to partner with some dangerous savages? Buffalo hunting gave the Indians so much meat and hides for their teepees that their nomadic life became very different than it had been before, and the numbers of many tribes increased so much that they began to fight with other tribes for hunting grounds by necessity. And then the palefaces came from the east. White man, vodka, smallpox, and bullets, that's doom, said the Indians, who had tasted the fruits of civilization. During the Internecine War of 1861 to 1865, between the North and the South, the onslaught on the West waned. But in 1863 the Homestead Act was passed, railroad construction began after the Northern victory, and new crowds of settlers and laborers poured onto the prairies. The situation became especially disastrous after gold deposits were found in 1874 in Montana, near the Black Hills. German writer Lieselota Welskopf-Henrich, in her remarkable trilogy Sons of the Big Dipper, which was later made into a feature film, very vividly showed how Indians were deprived of their own land for the love of pale-faced people to Yellowstone's gold. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the whites killed the buffalo with the following reasoning: no buffalo, no Indians. Something had to be done about the Indians, and in February 1876 Major General George Crook, known for his experience in subduing the Apache Indians, moved with his troops into the territory of the Sioux and Cheyenne Indians to force them to move to reservations. The American Army in the Wild West relied on a network of forts built there, which were small strongpoints, fortified points. There were barracks for soldiers, shops for bartering with Indians, and stables. Cannons were rare, because attacks on forts rarely involved more than 24 Indians. Of course, it looks a little different in the Winnetou movies, but that's what movies are for. In order to force the Indians onto the reservations, the government assigned dragoon and infantry regiments, albeit incomplete, to the war with the savages. It was thought that this was enough, especially since the Indians themselves were always feuding with each other. The Dakota Sioux hated the Crow and the Shoshone, and the latter willingly went to the whites and served as scouts to take revenge on their red-skinned brothers. The policy of divide and conquer was approved by the U.S. Congress in 1866, when the U.S. Army was reinforced with 1,000 Indian soldiers, who were paid the same salary as white cavalrymen, $30 a month. To the Indians this amount seemed fantastic, and their admiration for their financial success did not diminish even when they were paid half as much. However, dollars at that time were no match for today's dollars. Remember Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer? For $1 a week a boy of his age could have a table and an apartment, and even wash and cut his hair for the same money. However, scout troops of Pawnee Indians were organized as early as 1861, and it was with their help that many other Indians, their enemies, fell into the traps of the paleface and were ruthlessly destroyed. Hoping to settle scores with other Indians, the Comanches and Kiowas, the Crows and Shoshone, the Blackfeet, the Arikara, and even the Sioux went scouting. For example, it was the Sioux, named Bloody Tomahawk, who later killed Sitting Bull, the great Sioux Dakota chief. Moreover, the Indians did not realize that by acting in this way, they were playing into the hands of their enemies, and there were only a few who understood and nobody listened to them. The attack on the Indians was carried out in full accordance with the rules of the then military science, Uendi Kolonnen Marscherer, Zwei Kolonnen Marscherer. The first column was commanded by General Crook himself. The commanders of the others were Colonel John Gibbon and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, commander of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Interestingly, being, as we said, a lieutenant colonel, George Custer was at the same time also a general and even had his own general's flag. How could this be? Very simply, he earned the rank of general during the Civil War, and when he was only 23 years old. Then he left the army, and when he returned, he managed to get only the rank of lieutenant colonel, although no one deprived him of the rank of general. Opposed to the long knives, i.e., cavalrymen with sabers on their sides, Indians of different tribes united due to circumstances. In the bend of the Rosebud River, the Indians first engaged General Crook's soldiers. They began it scattered, but it led them to unite in one common camp, where together came together and Subrul, and Blackfoot, and Sans Arc, and Minicoji, and Assiniboine, and Arapaho and Cheyenne. There also happened to be the well-known Indian chiefs, Tatanka Yotanka, Sitting Bull, and Tachunko Witko, Crazy Horse. General Crook was in turn supported by the Crow and Shoshone, who went out on the warpath with their tribesmen, a total of 262 Indian warriors. There were Indian scouts in General Custer's detachment as well. On June 21, 1876, the soldiers of Gibbon and General Alfred X. Terry met near the Yellowstone River to march together. General Terry had no doubt that the Indians were somewhere near the Little Bighorn. He ordered Custer with his mounted regiment and scouts to march to the Rosebud River. Contemporaries of the events and later American historians noted that while Colonel Gibbon's group, moving down the Yellowstone River, consisted of only 450 soldiers, Custer had about 650, and he also had reinforcements in the form of 6 companies of infantry. Thus, he had a total of 925 men under his command, a very impressive force for the time. Custer needed to outflank the Redskins and drive them into a pincer between the troops of the other 2 commanders. For an experienced commander, and Custer was just that, an operation of this level could not be very difficult. In fact, it was the ABCs of maneuver warfare on the Great Plains. Yes, but who was he? General George Custer, who fought at Little Bighorn as a lieutenant colonel and regimental commander. What was he, both as a man and as a commander? It is known that, while still in the army of the Northmen, he flaunted picturesque attire, distinguishing himself among officers of equal rank. So his dragoon uniform was, contrary to the rules, sewn not of blue cloth, but of black velour with linings gallianami according to the southern fashion, with which he wore a sea-shirt. On a campaign against the Indians, he also did not wear a uniform of the proper pattern, but wore a suede suit with fringed hem and sleeves. For his yellow, straw-colored hair, the Indians gave him the nickname Yellow Hair, and he grew it so long that he spread it in curls over his shoulders. On this expedition, however, he cut his hair rather short. Again, instead of weapons, which were supposed to have by statute, Custer took 2 relatively small, but large-caliber revolvers, Webley Bulldog, which in the U.S. were produced under English license, caliber 11. 4mm, a carbine Remington Sporting, and a hunting knife in Indian embroidered sheaths. He wrote about his attitude to the Indian question in the book My Life on the Great Plains. That is, he was also a writer, where he wrote that, yes, civilization is Moloch, that Indians are children of the earth, but that they should submit, otherwise they will just be crushed. Now we have tolerance and the desire to understand everyone. But back then everything was very simple. You don't smoke cigars, you don't play poker, you don't drink whiskey, and you have long hair, wrong nose, and dark skin. That means you are a savage, and with a savage there was a short conversation. Either you are a servant and accept me, a white man, as I am, or I shoot you. About 80 kilometers from the site of the Battle of Rosebud, Custer sent a scouting party of his Indian scouts on patrol. His infantry was far behind at that point, and he himself was moving quickly forward with his 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army. Custer's scouts climbed Wolf Mountain, which dominates the area, from where they spotted an Indian village in the early morning hours of June 25, 1876. His scouts were also spotted, and they retreated and reported to Custer what they had seen. Custer immediately divided the regiment. To himself, he took 5 companies, C, E, F, I, and L, and gave Major Marcus Renault and Captain Frederick Benton 3 companies each. This gave Renault 140 men, Benton 125, and Custer 125. The companies were of varying strength, with Renault also having a Crow Scout troop of 35 men. The Indians in camp did not expect their pale-faced enemies to attack them so soon, and Custer, in turn, did not expect their camp to be so crowded. There were about 4,000 warriors alone. Meanwhile, Renault's detachment attacked the Indians along the Little Bighorn River and at first had some success. The Indians did not expect such a swift attack, but very soon they came to their senses, and he had to deal with a large number of warriors, led by Sitting Bull, the high priest of the Dakotas. Reno was forced to retreat to the river and tried to take up defenses in the thickets on its banks, but from there he was driven out. Reno lost more than 40 soldiers, but managed to get across the river, where there was a small hill, and where his soldiers put their horses and hastily entrenched themselves. Then Captain Benton and his men came here, and so the 2 of them defended this hill until the next day, suffering from thirst and shooting from the Indians, until they were taken out of the encirclement by General Terry's reinforcements. The enemy on the top of the hill, however, did not occupy the Indians too much. They believed that only cowards fought that way, and that defeating them was not worth much. That is why only a small group of Indians remained around this hill, and their main forces went back and moved away from the camp to where George Custer's soldiers appeared at the ford across the river just at that time. There is a view that if he had not delayed, but had acted at the same time with Reno's detachment, he would have had every chance of breaking into the Indian camp and creating a panic in it. According to others, he did reach the camp, but was driven from it by the Cheyenne and Sioux, whose numbers were upwards of 2,000 men. It is now impossible to ascertain what really happened there. The last man of Custer's troop to be seen alive was an Italian, Giovanni Martini, a trumpeter who spoke almost no English. He delivered a note from Lt. William W. Cook, which read, "Benton, this way. Big camp. Hurry up. Bring ammunition. W. Cook." Apparently, Custer wanted to build on his success, for which he needed ammunition. However, he would not have been able to get the Indians in his clutches. There was no cellular communication then, and he did not know, nor could he have known, that Reno's detachment had by this time been driven back and thus allowed the Indians to concentrate all their forces against him. Custer. Benton, to whom Lieutenant Cook had sent a messenger, was deep in the rear, and was in no hurry to get to the place of the fight. So Custer found himself all alone, but he still did not know it. Meanwhile, the Indians joined forces, the Sioux Oglala led by Crazy Horse and Cheyenne, then the Sioux Hunkpapa with Gall, Bile, and with him other Sioux. Therefore, many historians believe that by stopping and fighting in the open, Custer signed himself and his troops' death warrant. In fact, he signed it earlier, when he ordered his detachment for some reason to split into 2 parts, 3 companies, which he entrusted to Captain McKeough, C, I, and L, he sent against the Indians advancing from the north, and himself with the remaining 2, E and F, together with Captain George White, decided to hold the crossing of the river. Meanwhile, the Indians, in spite of the open fire, were still arriving, and Custer hastened to give a new order for the 2 detachments to rejoin and concentrate on the top of the nearest hill. The soldiers put their horses on the ground, dug their rifle cells, and began to shoot back. This hill was named Colquhoun Hill in honor of George Custer's half-brother James Colquhoun, commander of Company L. A heavy fire from Springfield and Sharp's carbines fell upon the Indians. Now, let's do a little archaeology and dig into the American soil, both at the top of this hill and at its foot. For a long time, none of the Americans could not think of it, but then the excavations were carried out and they gave surprising results. In 300 feet from the top of the mentioned hill, archaeologists found many rifle casings from Henry and Winchester rifles, which Custer did not have. Consequently, the Indians in this battle widely used firearms, and not any, but the most modern, which was absent even in the U.S. Army. It is now impossible to say for what reason Custer withdrew from this hill and took up defenses to the north. Perhaps the Indian attack had split his forces in 2, and he simply wanted to save the soldiers who had survived? Who knows? In any case, the location of the Winchester cartridges and the testimony of Indian witnesses suggest that he did not stop on the north slope of Battle Ridge Mountain, where his monument now stands, but moved to Last Stand Hill, and there his men again came under heavy fire. Of those who did not leave with Custer, 28 men somehow managed to get down the hill and found a last refuge in a deep ravine, but then surrendered anyway and were killed by the Indians. In the end, Custer's detachment, including himself, was completely destroyed by the Indians, who had decided in advance not to take prisoners. All of Custer's relatives, whom he took with him, brothers Thomas and Boston Custer and his nephew Odier Reed, were also killed in the battle. The corpses of white soldiers were stripped, scalped, and mutilated by Indians so that some soldiers could not be identified. And this was evidenced not only by their bodies on the battlefield, but also by drawings made by a Sioux Indian named Red Horse. It should be noted that they clearly show bullet wounds received by Custer's soldiers. That is, they were killed with guns, not with arrows, as some researchers still claim. All in all, 13 officers, 3 Indian scouts were killed, a total of 252 men. For Indian wars, this was a huge number. Indian casualties looked much more modest, about 50 killed and 160 wounded. An Indian scout named Bloody Knife, Custer's best scout, a half Sioux, half Arikara, Dakota, was beheaded and his head put on a pole. By some miracle, Captain M.C. Keogh's Comanche horse was saved in this massacre. The Indians could not catch him, and he returned to his white masters. Later, with a saddle on his back, he took part in all the parades of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, and after his death at the age of 28, he was stuffed with straw and exhibited in the Kansas Museum of Natural History. Is it safe to say that Custer was abandoned by everyone and no one even tried to find out what happened to him? That all the other officers in his unit were cowards and mutual aid was non-existent? No, you can't. When the message from Lieutenant Cook arrived, Captain Thomas Ware, without waiting for orders, went in search of the distressed squadron. With his men, he traveled a distance of 1 mile toward the mountains, but never met Custer, although, as Lieutenant Winfield Edgerly afterward reported, they saw a great many Indians riding up and down the river valley and shooting at objects on the ground. Captain Benton and the 3 companies at his disposal then joined Ware's detachment, but it was decided not to search further, in view of the presence of a clearly superior force of the enemy. Well, now it makes sense to go back to 1860, when an American Christopher Spencer, who was only 20 years old, created the first carbine with a magazine in the stock. President Abraham Lincoln ordered to purchase them for the Army, but after the Civil War the number of orders went down, and Spencer's company was bought by Oliver Winchester, who got rid of the only dangerous competitor. Winchester was developing his own rapid-fire weapon system, the Tyler Henry carbine. Its magazine was located under the long barrel. To load the gun, one had to rest the stock on the ground, pull the cartridge pusher with a spring to the top of the tube. It had a special tab for this purpose, and pull the magazine tube aside. Then the cartridges were inserted one by one. The tube was placed under the feeder, which was released together with the spring. With 15 cartridges in the magazine and 16 in the barrel, this weapon had an amazing rate of fire, 30 rounds per minute. It was also very easy to handle. It had a lever under the stock neck, which was an extension of the trigger guard. When the lever was pulled down, the bolt went backwards and automatically cocked the trigger, and the cartridge was fed from the magazine under the barrel to the feeder. The lever would go up, and the feeder would raise the cartridge to the level of the barrel, and the bolt would feed the cartridge into the breech block and lock the barrel. But it took a long time to load it, so the new carbine had a spring-loaded magazine window on the side, through which cartridges were loaded into the magazine, instead of the way it was before. The model was called the Winchester Model 1866, and the 1873 model soon followed. Although not designed as a battlefield weapon, the Winchesters became very popular on the battlefield. Thus, Turkey successfully used them against Russian troops in the War of 1877 to 1878. In the Battle of June 30th, 1877 near Plevna, Turkish cavalrymen gave their Winchesters to infantrymen, and each shooter had 600 rounds of ammunition. As a result, the Russian infantry, despite all its heroism, failed to reach the Turkish trenches. In front of it stood a continuous curtain of fire and lead, and its total losses from the 2 assaults exceeded 30,000 men. And it should be noted that something similar happened during the Battle of Little Bighorn. To fire a Springfield carbine with a hinged bolt, you had to pull the trigger with your finger, then pull the bolt forward, put a cartridge in the chamber, and take the cartridge out of the ammunition pouch. After the bolt was closed, and it was necessary to put the carbine back to the shoulder, aim, and only then to shoot. When firing from the rifle, the stock could be kept on the shoulder, and the target was not out of sight, so the speed and efficiency of firing increased many times. 1/3 of American horsemen had Sharps carbines. Their bolt also had the same trigger guard as the Winchester, but it had no magazine. Before firing, the trigger was pulled, the bolt was lowered down, and the empty cartridge case was ejected from the chamber. It had to be removed by hand or shaken out, put the cartridge into the chamber, and then raise the bolt back to the previous position to lock the barrel. All this took as much time as loading a Springfield carbine. However, the Sharps had a larger caliber, 13.2 mm, which increased its striking qualities, but at the same time it had stronger recoil. In addition, it is necessary to hit the target, which is much more difficult for an experienced shooter than for those who use a Winchester. That's why, although not very powerful revolver cartridges of 11, 18 or 11, 43 mm caliber were used in Winchesters, they were often used as a combat weapon, especially when high fire density and high rate of fire were needed. Note that American soldiers, in addition to the carbine, also had Colt Revolver's Peacemaker, Model 1873, a decent weapon, but not self-loading, and required cocking the trigger after each shot. All 6 of its chambers were reloaded sequentially, which in this situation made it practically a disposable weapon. However, the most important question is still unanswered. How did the Dakota Indians end up with Winchester and Henry carbines, and even in such quantity, although they were not in service with the American Army and could not be captured as trophies? It turns out that a large batch of them was sold to the Indians in violation of all the rules that prohibited the sale of modern weapons to savages. That is, the situation with the sale of weapons to the Indians, which was described in the novel Lieselotte Welskopf Henrik, could well have taken place in reality. Naturally, there is also a very important question: what did the Indians pay for it to the white traders? After all, the Winchesters were very expensive. Prairie Indians had no valuable furs, and hardly anyone needed buffalo hides at that time, as their herds had not been massacred yet. And it was very dangerous to sell a large consignment of weapons. You could go to jail. However, one does not need deductive powers to reconstruct the whole chain of those dramatic events. The Indians, preparing for the Long Knives fight, bought high-speed rifles for gold from Black Hills. How much they paid is known only to those who delivered and sold these weapons to them, but apparently the amount of profit was enough for greed to overcome all fear. But these traders failed to supply the Indians with ammunition on a regular basis. Or the Indians ran out of gold. And when the supply of ammunition for the riflemen ran out, the Indians had to surrender. And that's how the Indians wiped out Custer's posse. And then what? And then they gathered up the abandoned weapons of the soldiers and before nightfall turned them against the soldiers of Reno and Benton. But their enthusiasm gradually waned, and they preferred to break camp and to conceal their departure from the enemy, set fire to the grass. The soldiers looked at the smoke and rejoiced. They considered it a victory and reported it to General Terry, who came up with his troops the next day. Well, the Indians moved on to the Powder River region. There, on August 15th, they divided and the big camp ceased to exist. This at once brought great relief to the whites, enabling them to beat the Indians one by one. Some tribes were able to be driven onto reservations, others were simply scattered. Some of the Indians went to Canada under the protection of the Great Mother, the British Queen Victoria. So, the Indians won one battle, but ultimately lost the war. Immediately after the burial of Custer's soldiers, an investigation was held into the tragic circumstances of their deaths, deciding who was to blame and who to punish. Custer himself, who had attacked a superior enemy force, or Renault and Benton, who were holed up on a hill in relative safety. Knowing the character of the Lieutenant Colonel General, many blamed only himself. It was said that he was characterized by overconfidence and that he had taken his relatives on the campaign because he hoped for an easy victory and for their rapid promotion, that he had shown frivolity in believing his scouts. With regard to Renault and Benton, it was recognized that they had acted too cautiously, which also could not but be reflected in the sad outcome of the battle. On the other hand, everyone realized that Custer had a great deal of experience in Indian warfare and knew well that in the case of a clash with the savages on the plains, a dozen disciplined soldiers were worth 100 of their warriors. It should be noted here that contrary to the popular belief that the Indians were excellent warriors, in fact it was not quite so. They lived war, their girls danced the scalp dance, but they did not know how to really fight. A young man who wanted to win a girl's affection could go on a military campaign. A girl who wanted to marry could call young men to the campaign, and in a red dress, with a feathered spear in her hands, gallop in front of them shouting, "The bravest will take me as a wife." And the warriors who followed her tried not so much to kill their opponents as to make coup to touch them with a special stick or hand. The killed were bragged about, scalps were bragged about, but wounds and coup were valued most of all. Yes, among the Indians there were alliances of warriors never running, who before the battle tied to each other by penises, and the end of the rope was nailed to the ground. And they really did not run, however any chief could release them from this vow by pulling it out of the ground. So on and so forth. There were no better scouts, but there were no worse soldiers. But as it happened, in this case quantity turned to quality, and his experience did not help Custer. There were too many of them and many turned out to have Winchesters. By the way, his own weapon, a Remington carbine, was also a single-shot weapon. Custer's soldiers were helpless under the barrage of prairie warriors. So the main victory at Little Bighorn was won not by anyone, but by Mr. Oliver Winchester, whose carbines fell into the hands of the Indians through the efforts of unknown arms dealers. Today, the site of the Battle of Little Bighorn is regularly visited by numerous tourists. A memorial monument was erected there in 1881, and in 1890, marble headstones were placed over each soldier's grave. The Indians were also honored in memory of the fallen soldiers of the Union of the Five Tribes. 100 yards from the monument to the Seventh Cavalry Regiment of the is a monument in their honor. A 3-mile-long walking trail at the battle site runs from Custer's Hill and the Reno and Benton Monument, passes Ware's Hill, Colhoun's Hill right to the Little Bighorn River ford, and to other memorial sites. The 60-color installations that line the trail provide a vivid picture of the events of this battle. In 1999, 3 red granite Indian markers were added to the memorial. The land around the trail is privately owned, so it is best not to ignore the forbidding signs that stand here and there. It's best to visit in spring or fall, when it's especially beautiful. And yet, when you look at these hills and try to hear the murmuring of the Little Big Ram, you think first of all not about the beauty of the local nature, but about the tragedy that played out here, and what lesson this story has taught the paleface.